And welcome into Talk Illini here, a part of Orange and Blue News of the On 3 Network. We appreciate you being here as we do have some news with Illinois football. The Illinois basketball team is doing very well. Excited to talk about them as the season continues to go. But it is the offseason for the football team. The transfer portal is closed, which means it's time to let some coaches move on and try to figure out where some more coaches are going to. So if you have been paying attention, Illinois has lost a few assistant coaches here recently. Running backs coach, special teams coordinator / tight ends coach Rob Disher, and the big name Aaron Henry, defensive coordinator for the Fighting Illini. He has been hired by Notre Dame. Now, a lot of talk about how maybe Aaron Henry moving on was not so much fired or anything like that, but there was a possibility that he would not be calling plays next year. And so Aaron Henry moves on to a different area to, not lose his play calling and things like that. And we can get into that if you want to, Carson. But I think the biggest discussion to have here is who is going to replace Aaron Henry as the defensive play caller of this team next year. I don't think Brett Bielema is going to have himself do that. So I do think he's going to go out and hire somebody. Let me ask you this before we get started, Carson. What do you think the perception of this Illinois defensive coordinator job is? Obviously, it's much better than it was in years past. I wouldn't say that this is like a destination defensive coordinator job. However, this is in the Big Ten. They have the opportunity to be paid very well, and they have the opportunity to really make a name for themselves, as Illinois is a team that's kind of in and out of the rankings and was ranked in the top 10 this last preseason. What are your thoughts on the job overall and the prestige it has in college football?
Yeah, I think infrastructure is a big consideration for any prospective defensive coordinator. Coach Bielema has a track record now that he's built up over the course of the last 2 decades, where a lot of his coordinators do go on to become head coaches. He's one of the top 5 or 6 coaches in the sport when it comes to producing head coaches under his own coaching tree. So, an opportunity to coach under Bielema for X number of years and potentially move up if you're successful. We saw it with Illinois' last defensive coordinator prior to Aaron Henry. Ryan Walters did an outstanding job in just a couple of years at Illinois, and he quickly, he came from Mizzou as their DC. Their fans weren't necessarily the happiest with him when he left, and he came to Illinois, very quickly built a great defense, and he was the Purdue head coach in short order, right? He's had other coaches go on. Paul Chryst at Wisconsin was a Bielema assistant prior to becoming their head coach. So he's had a lot of guys come up from under his coaching tree, and I think in general, the opportunity to coach with Coach Bielema is huge. I also think they have a fantastic group of coordinators and position coaches to work with. So if you're a defensive coordinator, having positional guys that are great at recruiting, Corey Parker is one that comes to mind, who's kind of an ace on the recruiting trail. Having guys like that already in the building makes your job a lot easier. And especially if you're going to take a job like this, it is a little bit late in the cycle of, the coaching hiring cycle. So, having a guy like I said, a Corey Parker, or even like a Terrence Jamison, who's like an elite developer of talent in the building already, I think helps a lot to your sell of, any prospective guy that might come in here.
Well, and also too with Brett Bielema as the head coach, because Brett Bielema is not going to continue to put you out on an island and make you look bad or anything like that. A lot of people, when they grade coordinators, look at the numbers, yards per game, yards per play, stuff like that. And you can be a really good coordinator, but if your head coach continues to put you out to dry, then that can not make you look so good. I'm not trying to take any shots here, but a coach that's kind of known for that is Lincoln Riley over there at USC, right? That defensive coordinator job is not exactly the most attractive one to many defensive coordinators, because you could be left out to dry and it could kind of ruin your reputation a little bit. And so I do think that we need to understand this Illinois defensive coordinator job. While it's not going to be the most coveted one in the nation, it is one that's going to be attractive to some people. And so as we list off some names here, some people might say, well, Illinois is never getting them. But I think it's actually more likely than some people think. And I think one of the names that we can start with here is Justin Wilcox, the former Cal head coach, who does not have a job right now. Now, he did a good job as a defensive coordinator, not so hot as the Cal head coach, but I don't think head coaching really means if you're going to be a good defensive coordinator or not. Carson, what are your thoughts on Justin Wilcox possibly being the next defensive coordinator?
Yeah, this is a really interesting hire, and it's kind of a full circle moment for Illinois fans who've been tapped in for a while. When the Illinois job last time, head coaching job, came open, Justin Wilcox was a hot name. He was on the prospective shortlist. Coach Bielema ended up getting that job, but Wilcox was a guy his name was in the running for the head coaching job at Illinois. So clearly, early on during his Cal tenure, he did a good enough job to be on those kinds of boards. And, if you're looking at the tenure he's had at Cal, it's been kind of up and down, but he's also a coach who, is maybe excelled as a coordinator, but it's kind of suffered at times, especially because of the transfer portal. Cal's a hard school to get into. It's very hard to transfer to Cal. It's very easy to transfer out of there. And, he's a great evaluator of talent. It's a tough school to recruit to. And Cal, in my opinion, has kind of outperformed relative to the resources they have for the better part of the last decade since he's been there. And you look at his scouting profile, too, as a head coach. He's the guy. Curt Cignetti is going to get a lot of credit for Fernando Mendoza. Justin Wilcox is the guy that offered him on signing day when he was a 2-star committed to Yale. He's like, he took a shot on a kid and he developed him for 3 years before he became what he became at Indiana, right? JR and Carson, Sangapolu-Tele, the 5-star from this year. Wilcox offered him as a 3-star quarterback when he was a junior, got an early commitment from him. And then he blew up. He went to Oregon, came back to Cal, and he was what he was this year as a freshman. But again, that's a guy that he scouted early. And now that is on the offensive side of the ball. But, if we're talking about recruiting, talent ID, and development, this is the guy I'd be very excited about. He's got a great track record with finding high-level talent.
Yeah, totally. I think Justin Wilcox would be fantastic if they were able to get him to come to Illinois. And I should preface that some of these names we're going to discuss here, we're just kind of discussing as like possibilities. We're not getting into this and saying like this is a for sure person that Illinois has talked to or anything like this, because at this point, with Aaron Henry moving on, I think Illinois is going to move very quickly on this, but there's not a whole lot of chatter behind the scenes or anything yet to say like, this is our guy, this is the guys that we've interviewed or anything like that. So these are just kind of guys that we see as possibilities and trying to level out, how likely is this to possibly happen? And based off what you're saying, Carson, and kind of what I think, I do think Justin Wilcox could be more of a possibility than some people might think. Another one that could be a possibility is Mark Stoops, former Kentucky head coach. Some of these guys, if they want to get back into head coaching, Brett Bielema, like you said, can put that out there and say, look, I get defensive coordinators to be regarded well enough that they can go out and be head coaches. You want to be a head coach again? Come here to Illinois and you can have really good defense and go do that. What are your thoughts on Mark Stoops possibly being the next defensive coordinator at Illinois?
Yeah, Mark Stoops is kind of an interesting candidate here because he doesn't necessarily need to be a coordinator again, but it's a good option for him. Again, he's a guy, he could probably just wait a coaching cycle and then re-enter his name into the conversation next cycle and get, a MAC job or a Sunbelt job pretty quickly at the head coaching level. But if he wants to get back into coaching this year, there's only so many options available for him. I think Illinois would be a natural fit. He's a guy outside of recruiting Kentucky and a little bit of the Southern U.S., he kind of built his bread and butter on recruiting Ohio and other parts of the, kind of Rust Belt. That's what those winning Kentucky teams early in his tenure were built off of. He's got an excellent track record with, again, scouting, talent ID. He took the 3 stars from Ohio that Ohio State didn't want and turned them into, all conference level players or high level contributors in the SEC. And, Kentucky never went 10-2 consistently, but going 7-5 in the SEC in the mid-2010s was not an easy job. Brett Bielema, when he was at Arkansas, 7-5 every year was probably a realistic, high-level goal for him. And I think Kentucky's the same deal. They don't invest a ton in their football program compared to other SEC schools. And I think Mark Stoops, as a head coach, significantly outperformed the resources that he had. So, again, I think he'd be a great fit. I think he'd be a guy that would be a 1-year or 2-year rental if he were to come to Illinois, but it would make a ton of sense for both sides.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. If they can make it happen, it's worth it. In this day and age with how much, rosters are kind of recycled and done in different ways, I'm totally fine with a guy that's only there for 1 or 2 years. You don't necessarily need your coordinators to be there 5, 6, 7 years nowadays in college football, it seems like. Another name that we can mention, Carson, is Ryan Walters. Ryan Walters out there at Washington. And, we talked about how Lincoln Riley doesn't always set up his defensive coordinators in the best position. Jed Fish is not Lincoln Riley, but he is more of an offensive minded guy. And so there is the thought process that if Ryan Walters wants to kind of replicate what he did before, could he possibly come back to Illinois? He seems happy out there at Washington, so I'm not sure if he would be willing to make the switch this late in the cycle over there to Illinois. But what are your thoughts on Ryan Walters as a possibility to come back to Illinois and be the defense coordinator?
Yeah, this is a name I've seen floated by more fans than maybe, like analysts, but it is a name I'm sure the staff would consider it if there was mutual interest, but I don't necessarily view it as the most likely outcome to happen. At the time when Coach Walters left to become the Purdue head coach, there were some questions of, was he possibly recruiting some guys some transfers that had taken visits to Illinois to join him at Purdue? There was a big debate over Hudson Card, who took consecutive visits to Illinois and Purdue, with Illinois coming first. And then shortly after his Illinois visit, he basically immediately committed to Purdue the second he got on campus at West Lafayette. And in between those two visits was also when Coach Walters was announced as the Purdue head coach. So there was a lot of speculation as to, just kind of stuff around that. I don't know what happened there. I wasn't in the rooms where those conversations happened, but maybe he didn't leave Illinois on the best terms. So I'm sure coaches Bielema, Walters, so on and so forth, in the years since have probably talked and hashed things out if there was anything to hash out. So it's always possible, but I don't necessarily expect it. And again, I think Coach Bielema is a guy, he's going to have a lot of input into his defense naturally. He's, grew up on the defensive side of the ball as an early coach. He was a linebackers coach and a DC before he became a head coach. There's going to be a lot of guidance there, and I think that guidance helped Coach Walters become a head coach the first time around. But, at a Washington, you have to look at the gives and the takes of being the DC there. He will be kind of like you mentioned with the Lincoln Riley, the fall guy if the defense doesn't go well, but also he has the freedom to control his own defense entirely, which if the defense is great, that might give you more leverage in head coaching negotiations in the future, as opposed to if you come from an Illinois. It could be a little tougher for some younger guys to get head coaching jobs because, the question was, how much involvement did Coach Bielema have in your defense? The answer is usually quite a bit. But, if the defense is good, the defense is good. So I don't necessarily view Coach Walters as a likely candidate, but I do understand why fans would like to have him be considered because the defense was fantastic when he was here.
Mm-hmm. It was. They did a fantastic job, and I definitely understand it as well. Now let's talk about some guys. We just talked about three outside hire guys, and I think we would be mistaken if we didn't say that it's a possibility that an internal hire could happen in this situation as well. As you mentioned, Illinois has a good defensive coaching staff. Terrence Jamison is the co-defensive coordinator right now. Corey Parker, Archie McDonald, he was just there for this season, so he's not necessarily a long tenured guy or anything like that. But Corey Parker and Terrence Jamison seem like guys that are at the very least going to get a look to possibly be the next defensive coordinator. What's your thoughts on some of these internal hire possibilities?
Yeah, I don't think an internal hire is probably the direction they go, but if they do go that direction, my logical pick would be Terrence Jamison. He's been the co-defensive coordinator since 2023, so he's had a long tenure of maybe sitting in the room, helping with the game plan. He doesn't call the plays. That's never been his responsibility, but he's been part of the game planning. He knows what the defense likes to do. He knows what the defense, again, he's at practice every day, so he knows what they're good and bad at. And maybe the defense could look a little different if he was in charge of play calling. And certainly he's a guy that is loved by the players on the team. I think that'd be a good hire to make if you want to ensure cohesion moving forward. The players that, probably weren't as fond of the defense are probably not here anymore. We had kind of an exodus this offseason for a reason. So the guys that are still here, if Coach Jamison is the hire, I think they all would be very happy about that.
I think you're right. We'll see if it happens. He's not been a defensive coordinator before or anything like that. I do feel like this is probably a situation where Brett Bielema goes out and gets somebody with some more experience. But I had heard the rumblings, of fans and things like that saying, well, maybe it's an internal hire. We'll see what happens. But I would tend to think he's going to go to somebody with some more experience calling plays and things of that nature. Last one I'll ask you about here, and then I'll turn it over to you if you have any extra names or anything, Carson. Pete Kwiatkowski. He was the defensive coordinator of Texas this past season, had some smoke with USC after he gets fired from Texas. I don't think Texas had a bad defense this year, but Texas did not have the year they thought they were supposed to have. And when that happens, somebody's got to get fired, and Sark ain't firing himself on the offensive side of the ball. So they elected to fire Pete Kwiatkowski, had some smoke with USC. That doesn't end up working. Had some smoke with Stanford. That one doesn't end up happening either. What's your thoughts on Pete Kwiatkowski possibly being the next defensive coordinator at Illinois?
Yeah, I think it would be an interesting hire. Just looking at his resume, there are some gaps that I would raise questions for me. One is that he has no long-term experience coaching in the Midwest, or even like just general greater Midwestern regions. He's primarily been a West Coast guy, and Texas is really the only school in the South that he's coached at. So it's, he had stops at Washington, Boise State. Like we said, even the schools that he was mentioned with, USC and Stanford, he's never really recruited outside of the West and, maybe Texas footprint. Certainly Illinois likes to recruit Texas, but most of our coaches either originate from the Midwest, Florida, or have extensive coaching experience in the Midwest. So it would be kind of an outside the general purview hire, but I don't know if it'd be a bad one. You look at that Texas defense this year. He's recruited incredibly well as a coordinator to Texas. Texas was littered with high 4 and 5 stars across their entire defense this year. If one guy went down, they probably had a top 100 prospect waiting to go in. Now, will he recruit at that level in Illinois? Probably not, but certainly he's a great recruiter. I think he's a good game planner. And frankly, if Texas's defense was actually subpar this year, I think they would have gone a lot closer to 6-6 than the 9-10 wins that they had. I don't know if the defense was necessarily the issue at Texas. I'm sure there were complaints. You wouldn't fire a guy if, it was flawless, but certainly I don't think Texas's defense was a point of high concern, when I was watching them over the course of this year. So I think he'd be a great hire. I think it would make a ton of sense just on a schematic basis, right? If Illinois fans are worried about having an elite play caller, I think this would be with respect to Coach Henry, because I think he developed a lot as a play caller over the last 3 years. But I think this could be a step up in the play calling X's and O's department. And, recruiting might be kind of steady. Coach Henry was a fantastic recruiter as well. So I don't know if there'd be a jump or drop in recruiting level, but I do think it could be an upgrade in the schematic X's and O's portion of the game.
For sure. Yeah. And it's no disrespect to Aaron Henry. He came in with a lot less experience than somebody like Pete Kwiatkowski and would possibly come in with if he did come in to be the defense coordinator here. So we'll see what happens with some of these guys, internal, external. Carson, did you have any additional names or anything that you just want to kind of rapid fire real quick mention before we get out of here?
Sure. I've heard Seth Wallace's name mentioned. He's the associate head coach at Iowa. Again, this is one that I've seen more fans mentioned than probably analysts, but it does make a little bit of sense. Coach Bielema has Iowa ties. This is certainly a guy that he knows well. It wouldn't shock me if a call was made, but I don't necessarily see Seth Wallace leaving Iowa. Long term, I think if you've been at a program as long as Wallace has, it wouldn't make a ton of sense to jump unless you're given, a significant raise and a lot more responsibility. And I don't know if Illinois could necessarily offer that much, just difference. I think staying at Iowa probably makes a little more sense for him. But like I said, Iowa's a good program. When Coach Bielema came into Illinois, the sales pitch was that he was going to turn Illinois into what an Iowa or Wisconsin were. And, 5 years later, I think he's pretty much done that. And now the expectations have raised and they're looking to build even further. So, I think it'd be a good fit, but I don't know if that's, again, necessarily a guy that I would have be watching to be, a first choice.
Yeah, it's hard to pull guys away from Iowa there, especially with Kirk Ferentz possibly retiring at some point. I don't want to say soon because we don't know, but he's going to retire at some point, and somebody on that staff is, if Iowa continues to follow their trend, somebody on that staff is probably going to get the head coaching job, and that would seem to be something some of the people on that staff are maybe striving for. So we will see. Carson, that's all I got. You got anything else on any of these guys or anybody else before we get out of here?
No, nothing on the head coaching end. I'll do one quick hitter on the recruiting side. Illinois did land a commitment yesterday from Caden Consendine. He's a athlete out of Byron High School, a 3A school here in Illinois, kind of northwestern Illinois. Interesting track record. His dad played at Iowa, was a safety there, was a pretty good safety, went to the NFL, won a Super Bowl with the Ravens, so as a rotational safety there. So, the kid's got NFL lineage. Illinois small school football. His team went 14-0 and won a state title this year. He played linebacker most of his career, but Illinois is projecting him as a safety. He ran a 4.51 at a summer camp last summer, which caught the eye of Coach Pat Ryan, who's Illinois' high school director of relations. And they've kind of kept in contact since then, and they hosted him for an official over last weekend, gave him the committable offer, and he committed right away. He committed over a preferred walk-on spot from Iowa. So, grew up in a Hawkeye family, but will be an Illini. And, despite his, success as a defensive player, he had 84 tackles and 3 interceptions this year for his 14-0 state title winning team. He also was a monster running back for his team. 367 rushing yards in the state title game alone, set an Illinois state championship record in that game, and had over 2,000 rushing yards in the season and less than 160 carries. Pretty crazy stats, and 40 touchdowns to go with that. So the kid's very productive. If you're going to take a bet on a small school, high school kid, a guy logging a 4.51 coming off an injury, who is that productive, I'd feel great about that prospect profile.
For sure, and especially somebody with NFL lineage and everything like that, it seems like a no-brainer to me to take that one and just see what you got. And in today's college football day and age, you got so many more scholarships than you had before. Might as well take a flyer on some of these guys and see if they can come in and contribute. If they don't, is what it is, move on. But if they can, could be a huge boost for the team. So, all right, Carson, thank you so much for coming in here and talking through the Aaron Henry defensive coordinator situation, a little bit of recruiting there at the end. Do remember to like and subscribe, everybody, and follow us here on Talk Illini, and also go visit Orange and Blue News, part of the On3 Network, the Illinois site affiliate for them. A lot of good stuff over there. Doug and those guys do a great job. Carson included there, of course, and then you can find me, Sonny, and Carson here on the Talk Illini channel, talking all things Illinois football and basketball. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.